Welcome back to the UNCAVED podcast. Today I'm joined by Diana Glebova, a journalist and White House correspondent at the Daily Caller, whose work has been featured in places like National Review and EV Magazine. She also is a good friend who graduated summa cum laude from Columbia in 2021. Diana speaks 5 languages, including Ukrainian, and she's covered stories while traveling overseas, specifically about the war in Ukraine. She joins us today live from Washington, D.C. to talk about her experience on the Hill and the future of journalism. Without further ado, here's Diana. Yeah, it's been a while since we've seen each other, right? DC, probably.
DC, yeah, a few weeks ago, I'd say, but it's always nice to catch up with you and the other Columbia students.
So how does your working life compare to Columbia? Do you like it more or less, or how's that going?
I really love the working life. One of the main benefits is just having the time to work and then having a personal life as well. Because at Columbia, everything is always mixed. You're at your classes, then you have your clubs, and you're working on your homework. And I think really consumes one's time, just the university. But having a working life, it introduces you to so many more opportunities and people in the city. And yeah, just having the 9 to 5 and then having time to work on your own separate projects.
Very cool. Yeah, you majored in Slavic studies and languages, I believe. And now you're in the journalism world. So, I mean, I imagine too, that's been immensely helpful with your coverage of Ukraine and a lot of the stuff you've been up to. How did all of that kind of, come about?
Yeah, so at Columbia, I was actually in the dual BA program. So with Sciences Po, so 2 years at Sciences Po, where I studied political science, and then 2 years at the General School of Studies, where I studied Slavic studies. I think both of those foundations are very useful in politics and in foreign relations and in journalism in general, just because of the politics classes and the foreign language classes, but also because a political science program allows you to work a lot on writing and on public speaking. And I think that those are the foundational instruments used in this field. During my time at Sciences Po in Columbia, I surprisingly did not do a lot of journalism, actually. I know there are some newspapers at Columbia, like The Federalist and The Spectator, but I really didn't engage in those at the time. But I was always interested in writing and writing essays and writing creatively. I took some creative writing classes at Columbia that were very fruitful. And just writing on my own time, I knew that that was one of my passions. And coming out of school, I was applying to different places, mostly think tanks, places focused on foreign language. And just by circumstance, I applied to the Daily Caller for this journalism job to be an editor. It was, I think, the only journalism job that I applied to, but they decided to hire me. And the Daily Caller is very unique because it does take students right out of college with no experience. They teach you everything. It's a very young company, but it's all about really training the next generation of journalists. So I was very thankful for that opportunity. And again, I worked as an editor for about a year. I always told my boss that I was very interested in writing and not editing. That was more where my passion lied. And I think one of the lessons that I learned is that you always have to make your voice known about what direction you want to head in with your job. Because if I hadn't told him that I wanted to be a writer, he would have never known. I told him every couple weeks, I went above and beyond. I worked extra hours just to prove to him that he should hire me as a writer instead of an editor, and finally broke through to him. And I started writing more and more. And I had the opportunity to go to Poland and report on the Ukrainian refugees coming into Poland. So lots of opportunities there to travel and things like that. And then I came to my boss again after about a year of writing and editing in total. And I told him that I wanted to pursue the junior White House position because a colleague of mine had just left. Again, it's all about advocating for yourself and coming forward and saying what position you want. And I had the conversation with my boss. He eventually said that at the time this was not possible. And afterwards, I went to the National Review, which is based in New York. And actually, by a recommendation of a fellow Columbia student, I was lucky to get the position. And I was the breaking news writer there for about 4 months. And then after that time period, I got a text from my old boss from the Daily Caller calling me back and saying the White House position is now open, the senior White House position, and we'd like to have you back. So I think that was one of the most important text messages in my life, just because it's such a big career change. I had to move to DC in a few weeks, but it's the job that I had been eyeing for a long time, and it's been great so far here.
Oh, well, congratulations. You're obviously so successful at it. I've been, stalking you on Twitter from afar. When I see all the things that you've been up to, it's really, really cool. And you've been doing a lot of stuff in a really innovative way of journalism too, right? This is the first time in human history where we have something like Twitter. You're someone who's been able to travel all over the place. And you mentioned too that the Daily Caller has a pretty unique approach to journalism where they are hiring young people. So what do you think the future of journalism looks like, the sort of innovation that you see going on, right? Because you're someone who goes to Capitol Hill and talks to people there. But in addition, right, you're very active on Twitter, as many journalists are nowadays. You're traveling all the time, et cetera, et cetera. And you have a very academic background in something that is, more classically oriented than dournalism by itself. So all these things, I think you kind of see the shift in the frontier of journalism that's been going on for a few years now. And I'm curious, what's that look like for you, or how you've been surprised?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right that the future of journalism is at a critical point right now. I think that there's a lot of factors that feed into this, but especially the COVID-19 pandemic, which pushed a lot of people to be remote and accelerated the breakdown of the newsroom, where you picture a newsroom, everyone is in person. There's a boss that's yelling out headlines, everyone's typing on their computers. But a lot of companies nowadays are either fully remote, or people, half the company or a number of people at the company are working remotely, or there are just a few days a week where people come into the office. So I think that is one of the critical junctures right now. And also audiences based on, we know this based on just the number of view counts, but audiences are really going to digital instead of print. Print is largely going downhill in the number of audience members, and even broadcast and TV. Most people are reading their news now online. And like you said, social media has a big factor in this, because in the new digital age, having a platform on social media, mostly Twitter, and growing your following there is incredibly useful to share your content. But also, if you have a big following, that gives you the kind of credibility to say, I have a lot of people following my content, and I'm not just the brand. I have people that are following me individually. And I think that is another thing that is evolving in journalism, because there's a movement toward individual journalists having their own platform and growing their audience, not only on Twitter, but also creating their own websites and having their own Subtrack and posting their articles on social media and getting traction that way. I think one of the reasons that this is happening is because there's a growing distrust in the media, and audience members don't want to go to necessarily a media company, but they want to read individual people that they trust. And again, this gives way to more journalists. Also, the remote work gives way to more journalists, because you can live in more places now. You can travel. It's much more flexible. And it also gives way to niches where individual journalists can write about whatever they want, as long as there's an audience to support it.
Well, that's so cool. You're totally right. I didn't even think about that. I think nowadays too, people are really, concerned or about the fact, or intrigued by the fact that maybe journalism and entertainment are kind of shifting to become one of the same in a lot of ways, right? And it's funny seeing the younger generations gravitate towards these new platforms, Daily Wire, BuzzFeed, for example, that obviously have a very different reach and support compared to cable news or to Fox News or et cetera, any of those big players. And you're right too, the sort of personalization is weird, where the journalists themselves, not only their stories are kind of followed around, they have a cult presence a little bit. So how's that been too? I mean, you've been working at Capitol Hill. I'm curious how that interfaces with you kind of developing your own brand. You've got almost 20K followers on Twitter. Is that scary at all? Are people are starting to see you? Are you getting attacks or anything like that? How has that been when you're also just working alongside some of the most, influential and famous people on earth, right?
I think the attacks mostly come online, the haters online. It's much easier to write a mean comment than say it to my face. But just working in the White House has been a great opportunity to work with very much established journalists. Some of them have been there for over 40 years and have been reporting in the White House, just people on cable news that we all see at home. So it is a great opportunity to meet those types of people. And in DC in general, working on Capitol Hill as a young person, either if you're working at a think tank or the White House or working for a member of Congress, I think those are very popular jobs that students want coming out of college. And I think the job itself presents a great opportunity, but also all the opportunities available in DC in networking. There's an event that you can go to almost every single day here. And in DC and in many industries, who you know does play a big factor. So having the opportunity to go to these networking events, meeting bosses, meeting other people in other industries is very beneficial. Talking to some of my friends that work for members of Congress, so working directly on the Hill, they tell me that coming out of college, of course, it's not maybe the most paid job. It's actually a very low pay, but people fall in love with it because it is an opportunity to be young and have an impact on policies that influence everyday life and everyday politics. And people just fall in love with that process because, again, they have a front row seat to the action. They can contribute in their own way, and it can be a springboard into something new. So people are very excited about that. They love the fast-paced nature of DC, and it's a very lively city with, again, lots of events and lots of institutions here to get involved in.
Oh yeah, that front row seat aspects that you mentioned, I totally can relate to. I mean, I worked, I don't know if you know, as an intern reporter very briefly in DC while I was interning there. And I absolutely love DC as a result. And you're right, you have a job that's so sought after. There's so many people that want to be journalists or to be on the Hill, and you actually have that position, right? So, I mean, especially as someone who has your unique perspective, going to Columbia, having the views you do, which might be a little bit, unorthodox, and just having the position that you ended up in after your experience, et cetera. What's something that surprises you or you think would surprise other people that are looking at a similar job, people that are on the Hill?
Yeah, I think one factor that surprised me is that there is a lot of opportunity for growth once you do get the job. Coming out of college was, of course, a little nervous about applying to jobs and thinking, oh, how, what specific job do I really want? How am I going to get there? But once you start, I think if you're willing to go above and beyond and make yourself and your voice known about things that you're passionate about, there are so many opportunities in DC that has just been extremely shocking. So many different opportunities to work in communications, to work in in legislative assistant, in different think tanks, and even more, even opportunities that I'm not aware about. Again, just keeping your head down and working hard and networking will bring you a lot of fruit in DC, which was something that I was not necessarily expecting, but I'm extremely grateful for. And something else that my Columbia experience taught me was, again, like I mentioned, having the core curriculum aspect and studying political science and the different writing classes that I took, of course, bettered me to work in the position that I do now. But I think having that foundation is important, but what's most important after graduation is having the mentality that I need to learn things very quickly and having the ability to do that, just starting at a new company and learning everything on the spot, because college doesn't truly prepare you for that. That's the next step, where you join a company and you learn the basics right there. But after that, your future will accelerate very quickly.
Right. That's kind of scary too, that you spend all this time in class, et cetera. And then when you go to the working world, right, you're kind of thrown into the deep end and it's a totally new set of skills and stuff that school never prepared you for. But at the same time, what I think is cool is the more I get into thinking about history and journalism, the more I realize I sort of think of them as kind of analogous too. That the role of the historian and the journalist is both to, cover events and to distill it down to the underlying principles to communicate with other people. And to that end, I guess, how do you see your work as a journalist in serving those ends? And what do you think makes a good journalist? And how has that been part of your experience in Capitol Hill with the kind of stories you cover?
I think that's a great question, especially the point about it being a part of history. So in the White House, there's something that's called the pool of reporters that are connected to the White House Correspondents Association, and the pool. There's a rotating number of reporters that are in the pool, but they follow the president around, and their job is to write down any little remark that he makes. So I think just having reporters there all the time is a factor to contributing to history, because they are the ones that are writing this down and publishing what is happening on a day-to-day basis. And without their presence, a lot of little comments would get lost, or a lot of dynamics behind the scenes at the White House and the White House press room might not be reported on. And your second question about what makes a good reporter, I think trying your best to be independent is the number one thing. And working in the White House, and I know other reporters in DC struggle with this, because if you ask hard questions, there's going to be repercussions. And that's happened to me in the White House press room. I asked a few questions, and because of their nature, I think, again, because the questions were not necessarily favorable to the administration, which I don't think a question should be. I think a question should be challenging the administration to tell us the truth about what's going on, not just for them to present their talking points. Because I have that mentality of I'm not going to ask a question just so they can give a nice answer from what they want to say, but really to challenge them. That's been a little bit of an issue, because some journalists, I think, are willing to not go 100% and challenge, because they know that there's the fear of being ostracized. There's the fear of never getting to ask a question ever again, because you have that reputation. But I wish more journalists would come forward and not take any measure of attempted control from the administration and fight back, instead of complying and asking the type of questions that are a little bit easier, so that there is a more friendly or unchallenging atmosphere in the White House.
I think you're absolutely right. The role of a journalist is to uncover truth. When I was younger, I'd always say, like, oh, Superman was a journalist for a reason, right? He's the one that's uncovering truth for everybody and all these things. And to that end, you're right. It seems to be that, especially in recent years, there's been a lack of public trust towards the media in a lot of ways. No wonder there's all this polarization. And it seems to me, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's happening through even just the norms and practices of journalists that are on the job today. There's people who are on the left, people on the right that, ask questions respectively based off of what they want to hear. And yeah, what's your attitude towards that? How do you think we can change that? Or what do you think the changing landscape of that sort of thing is looking like more and more?
I think you're right. It is becoming more increasingly divisive and partisan. And when Americans are polled on that, they come back and they say, yes, we do distrust the media more, because some journalists and some media companies, they have their own agenda, right? But I think what I try to do, and what I think the role of a journalist is ideally, and what we should strive for, is to stick to the facts as much as possible, and to call out when the administration or certain elected officials are not telling the truth, even if that doesn't fit the agenda of the media organization or personal biases. I think that we have to, again, analyze it as straight as we possibly can, and just uncover their biases, uncover what they're trying to push that's not true, that's not factually accurate. We really need to come together and really attack those points.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I wish more journalists thought like you. And you mentioned too that, since you're up in the front row, right, getting to see all the action, you see a lot of the behind the scenes stuff too. So what are some of the things that the best stories you've been part of, or the things that the most juicy, like secrets of Capitol Hill, you've been able to uncover so far, if you don't mind sharing with the listeners?
Sure. So some of the articles that I've written have to do with the control that the White House tries to have over journalists. So, for example, Biden had a press conference, his second press conference in the administration a few months ago, and about 100 journalists were let in the room, and everyone was really excited to ask him questions, because that's such a big opportunity. You can really ask the president anything, But again, out of those 100 people, everything was already predetermined, where only 10 people were already pre-selected and put on a list, and they were the only ones that got to ask questions.
Wow.
Biden is not the first president to do this, but that doesn't make it okay. Even if there is a precedent, I think, again, trying to control the narrative, potentially, I'm not sure, potentially talking to the journalists beforehand to get their questions. I don't think that's ethical. And I think that there should be more transparency in how things are handled. And another story that just happened yesterday was Biden was having a press briefing on the unidentified aerial objects that the U.S. military has shot down recently. It was his first remarks on the matter at length. So again, all the reporters were really excited to go in there and try to have the opportunity to ask him a question about that. But the White House, again, had their own policies on who and who not was allowed to be even in the room where Biden was delivering the remarks. And they prohibited some journalists, including myself, from entering the room because I was not on their list. And they argued that there was not enough space in the room, but there was about 23 to 25 chairs that were empty. So there was plenty of space for everyone. But again, it's this element of control where they really want to maintain their talking points as much as possible. And if some journalists really challenge them on that, they're going to be banned from the room. They're not going to have the opportunity to ask questions at all.
Oh, wow. That's crazy to hear, right? Because it's one thing when we hear the questions to say, oh, they censored this thing or that, right, when they're answered. But to even think about what questions are allowed or what people are even allowed to be in the room at all, right? Those are all ways in which, too, you're right, you can see journalism being controlled in ways I think people wouldn't notice behind the scenes. Wow, that's crazy. And I imagine, you've also done some international work, traveling to Poland, right? You're Ukrainian yourself, and you were on the scene a lot of the ways when a lot of the war stuff started to break out. So I'm curious too, how do you think, what is your views on those sorts of things? How do you think there's been some misinformation, or what do you think as a journalist, you see a different perspective on those issues that we only hear about through the grapevine as like regular citizens?
Sure. On Ukraine specifically, I would say some of the misinformation or falsities or just spin that I've seen working in the media comes from some media sources being very partisan, and again, just having their own agenda on how they want to cover Ukraine and how they want to cover the Ukrainian president Zelensky. So yeah, the media companies having their own biases really paints the war in a different light depending on what outlet you watch. And again, it is about spin, it is about misinformation, but it's also about which facts they choose to cover, which stories they choose to cover, how the headline is written, or how the copy is written, what language is used. There are so many elements to really craft the story to fit your own narrative. And that's even happened in the war, which I think is unfortunate. And you mentioned me going to Poland last year. Again, that was a great opportunity. One of the benefits, I think, of working in journalism is sometimes having the ability to travel to report on the scene. And it was a really great time. I went by myself, just with a tripod and my cell phone. But I went around and I spoke to Ukrainian refugees. I spoke to Americans that were helping the volunteer effort. This was last spring, so almost a year ago now. And at that time, the war was very fresh and there was a lot of confusion about what was happening, and just wanted to report on that, but also all the people that were helping at the time as well, and what the Polish government was doing on that effort.
Oh, wow, definitely. You got to see it up close as well. Yeah, what are some ways in which you think, I guess if you can't get into specifics, no worries. What are some ways in which you think us normal citizens maybe don't get a full picture of the war situation being like? Because it's something that was in the headlines a lot. People are all in support of Ukraine. But what are some of the nuances or something that you think most Americans are not aware of, and that someone who has a Slavic languages background who, is Ukrainian gets a special picture of?
Maybe the number one thing is that, of course, most American stories are going to focus on how the war is impacting the U.S. There are, of course, stories from local people on the ground, but having family in Ukraine, almost every single person in my family lives there. just talking to them, it is a different perspective because I get to hear about the day-to-day in their lives. And they tell me if things are changing, if there's missiles again, what the attitude is on the ground. And also just the sad stories, the really tragic stories of people dying, of people having to leave their homes, of homes being destroyed, people being occupied, families being torn apart because of the occupation, and things like that. I think a lot of Americans forget the realities of that and just focus on, maybe the money or one specific policy or one specific plane that they do or don't want to send over. But there's a lot of real people that are impacted on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. Amen. I love how you've given some of your advice before to people who are at Columbia. For example, your EV magazine article you wrote about women at Ivy League colleges, how to survive there. To that end, I guess I would ask, do you have any updates on new advice you'd give them on being on the Hill? What advice would you give to someone who wants to be a good journalist? We talked about this a little bit before, but specifically if one wants to, really be successful on the Hill, doing the kind of thing you're doing, what would you tell them to do more specifically?
Yeah, so in journalism and in other fields in DC in general, I think if you're still at Columbia, if you're still not graduated, internship opportunities are good and very plenty in DC. And I think it's sometimes necessary to try out different fields to see if you do want to work in politics or at that specific company or not. That's just a great opportunity. And in politics, internships are very valuable, especially on the Hill, working for a Congress member or working in the White House, because a lot of interns are then hired for full-time positions. And even if you're not hired, if you choose to go somewhere else, it's one of the most valuable things I think that you can put on your resume, directly working in politics, and that being one of your first experiences. And again, DC is great because it has all the networking opportunities, all the other different events just outside your workplace. Lots of great opportunities to explore and meet different kinds of people, perhaps change what you are going to work in just based on a conversation you had with someone. Just a very flourishing place where I think there's a lot of different paths and a lot of different ways to get there. But if you come to DC, there's a great likelihood that if you work hard, that you will succeed in what you want to do.
Oh, Diana, it was such a pleasure talking to you. I'll see you soon. Next time I visit DC, maybe. And best of luck on the Hill. I'll be following you and all your cool journalism.
Thank you.
Good talking.